talk a little bit more about thesis statements because they are such a key element of writing an argumentative paper. Now, as you develop your thesis, it will probably change over time. As you continue to research and think about your paper and begin writing your paper, then you'll likely want to revisit your thesis statement to make it stronger, to make it better reflect the paper that you've been writing. But we've all got to start somewhere. So I'm going to take a look in this video at how you can start your thesis statement, and then what a weaker thesis looks like compared to a stronger thesis. And I'll walk you through how to write that stronger thesis, what the reasoning behind it is. I'm also going to take a look at a program that helps you to write your thesis that you can use online, which also might be worth checking out too. So what is a thesis statement? Already in this module, you've learned a bit about it, but I think it's helpful to break it down into particular ingredients that a good argumentative thesis statement should have. Now, it's usually one sentence, but it could be more. I've seen good two-sentence, even three-sentence thesis statements, but generally you can pack it into one, a little bit lengthier of a sentence. Your thesis statement is going to indicate the argument of your essay. What is it you're trying to convince the reader of? And to know that you've actually come up with an argumentative thesis statement, you want to ask yourself, am I making a claim that someone could dispute? Am I saying something in my thesis that somebody could argue against, where they could say, no, I don't think you're right about that, or no, I disagree, that's a bad idea. That's not true. If not, you might not have an argument, right? You want to make sure that your thesis statement is something that must be argued, that you must persuade a reader of. And that means that you need to have a thesis that is focused and specific enough to actually be proven in a relatively short paper. So you don't want to tackle a topic that's too big, one that people write whole books about. You want to narrow your focus so that you can give it appropriate attention in your paper, so that you can support it with good evidence. And then in this introduction, in this thesis statement, you'll give your reader a roadmap to the argument that you want to write. And writing a good thesis statement will also help you write a better paper, because the thesis will remind you, here's what I'm trying to prove, here's what I'm focusing on, and that will guide you as you write. So I think it's sometimes helpful to look at what a thesis statement, or rather what a good thesis statement is not, to get us started. Now, we've all probably been guilty of writing thesis statements like this before, and that's okay if that's where you start. But what we want to look at in this video is, how can we write stronger thesis statements? So a weak thesis statement would be something like, the internet makes it easy to learn a lot of information. Now, that is not very debatable. We know, pretty much anyone who's ever used the internet knows, that it's got a lot of information on it. Now, you could argue whether or not it's reliable information. You could describe what some of the best practices are for finding credible info, but this statement alone is not really much of an argument, and it's pretty general. It's pretty big. Another example of a weaker thesis statement is something like, using the internet has a positive effect on people. Now, that is an opinion that you can argue, but it's pretty broad. It's pretty vague. Positive effects? Like what? Using the internet how? There's a number of different things we use the internet for, and there are probably many ways we could describe it as positive. So you need to know what specific aspects of the internet and what specific positive things you are focusing on, and your reader needs to know it when they read your thesis statement. Another example of a weaker thesis statement is something like this one, where you announce your paper and say something like, this paper will consider the advantages and disadvantages of certain restrictions on free speech. Try not to announce that this is a paper. You don't need to say my paper will or my thesis is. try to state it more naturally, as I'll show you in some other examples. But another thing that's a little bit problematic about this thesis statement is it doesn't take a position. It just says I'm going to talk about advantages and disadvantages. That's not an argument, right? You want to choose specifically, am I trying to convince you that this is the greatest advantage of free speech restrictions, or we shouldn't restrict free speech because of this disadvantage? You do want to take a position. You don't want to cover pros and cons equally. That might sound strange because we know we don't want to have bias. We don't want to present imbalanced information. But you're not writing a report. You're not trying to cover every side or every issue on a topic. You want to focus specifically on something you have an opinion or position on and try to convince your reader to agree with you. So that means covering all of the advantages and disadvantages wouldn't be writing an argument. It would just be reporting information. And then finally, here's another one of those thesis statements that announces what your paper is going to do. This paper will look at the advantages of school uniforms, right? You're just telling me your topic. You're not actually giving me an argumentative thesis statement. If you were to write one that looks like this, I know from it that this is a paper that's going to say school uniforms have advantages, but that's not a lot to go on. Right? I do want to get more specific about that and preview for my reader what some of those advantages would be. So I think a good way to think about a thesis statement is that it consists of 3 primary ingredients. What's your topic? What is your specific position on that topic? And what are your reasons for believing that? So we say technology is our topic. What is our opinion about that? And how are we going to try to convince readers that we're right? Technology has decreased our level of connectedness to others, right? That could be a thesis statement. Technology has decreased our level of connectedness to others. But it's going to be a much stronger thesis statement if I also provide some of my reasons for thinking that my reader then understands, oh, the rest of the paper is going to go into those in more detail. So this is what I mean when I say your thesis statement creates a roadmap for your paper. It tells you what to focus on. If I print out this thesis statement and look at it as I write my paper, I know that I have to prove that technology has decreased our level of connectedness to others, and that I should have paragraphs that cover my reasons for believing that in order to try to convince my reader. So what are my reasons? Here we go. Because technology allows us to disconnect from the people in our physical environment, and it does not foster the social skills needed in order to help us to connect to those around us. Right? So we can see from this kind of thesis statement that my paper is going to explain my position by focusing on primarily 2 things. The way that technology causes a disconnect from other people that we are physically near, and that it doesn't give us the social skills we need to actually connect to people that are physically near us, right? And presumably in a paper like this, I would probably have to address a counter argument because people could disagree with this. This is not my position. This is just a sample argument statement. So you could easily adopt an opposite position and say technology has increased our level of connectedness to others because it allows us to connect to people who are far away from us, and it allows us to continue to build relationships, right? So you want to check your thesis statement and play devil's advocate with it and ask yourself, what would be the opposite of my thesis? Could someone argue against it? If not, you don't actually have a strong thesis statement. You want something that someone could disagree with. Your job is to convince them to agree with you, however. So our thesis statement has 3 ingredients there, and it's really going to help you write your paper if you start brainstorming about those reasons now. What is your topic? What is the specific position you want to take? And what are the reasons for it? So these are 3 questions you can sit down and ask yourself. Create a chart. and actually start writing down your answers if that helps you to brainstorm. What is your topic? We've already gone over this in your annotated bibliography. What is your opinion or position on the topic? What is the specific issue that you have an opinion on that you seek to convince your reader to agree with you on? And then finally, what are your main reasons for having that opinion? Why do you think you're right? That's going to build the foundation of your paper. You start with the questions, and as you develop your answers, you're going to develop your paper. And then you'll proceed to conduct research that will help you support your reasoning. Another way of looking at it might be, what is my topic? That question pretty much stays the same. What do I want to convince my readers of when it comes to that topic? Do I want them to think differently, or do I want them to take some kind of action? Do I want both? And then finally, how am I going to convince my readers of this? To do this or to think this? What are some good reasons to make them come over to my side and see what I see? And that the answers to those questions are going to build the backbone of your paper. So once you've started asking these questions, you can start drafting a thesis statement. And the more questions you ask, the more answers you come up with, the better position you are in to write a detailed, specific thesis. So I want to take a look at a couple of weak thesis statements and then take a look at how they could become stronger. So a weak thesis statement that we looked at before, this paper will look at the advantages of school uniforms, right? We said that's too vague, right? It needs some more detail there. So a stronger thesis statement that's going to broadcast to my reader exactly my focus in the paper, why I think I'm right, and it previews what I'm actually going to talk about in the body of my paper. School uniforms positively impact students and their parents, right? That's my thesis, that's an argument, and then I give my reasons. By lowering clothing costs, reducing on-campus violence and bullying, and creating a unified school experience. And so if I read that thesis statement, I now know that the paper is probably going to have at least 3 paragraphs. One about how school uniforms lower clothing costs, one that explains how it reduces on-campus violence and bullying, which will definitely require some evidence, and then another paragraph about how it creates a unified school experience. Now, depending upon how much information I have, then I might have multiple paragraphs per point, but you really want this thesis statement to be specific in its argument and to preview what the paper is going to talk about. So here's an okay thesis. This isn't bad, right? There's a clear opinion that's expressed here that someone could argue against. Corporations should provide more work from home opportunities and 6-hour workdays, right? So somebody could come back and say, no, they shouldn't, right? So obviously that's an arguable thesis statement that not everyone would agree on. Probably not a lot of corporations. So that's a pretty good start. But I could make it stronger by giving a sense of my reasoning, right? Maybe my reader is going to be skeptical as soon as they see that thesis statement. And so I want to nip that doubt in the bud and start to preview my reasoning. And so I could say instead, corporations should provide more work from home opportunities and 6-hour workdays so that office workers have a better work-life balance and are more likely to be productive when they are in the office. Right? So that's much more specific, much more reasonable. So this tells a reader who's deciding whether or not to read my paper after my introduction that I do have support for my opinion, that my paper is going to talk about and prove that this kind of working condition is going to create better work-life balance, better emotional well-being and health, and that's going to lead to more productivity, which corporations benefit from. So this thesis really broadcasts my argument. And the last thing I want to take a look at in this video is a program that you can find online, a thesis generator. I found a potentially useful resource at Ashford University's Writing Center. It's called a thesis generator. Now, I wouldn't recommend overly relying upon this for writing thesis statements, but what it does is it asks you a number of questions that are very useful when thinking about a thesis for an argument paper. And so you fill in the blanks, which helps you to discover, what is your argument? What are your reasons for it? And then what the program does is it generates a thesis statement for you. Now, sometimes the result comes out longer than you need for your thesis, or it might be worded in a clunky manner, in which case you should revise it so that you're happy with it. But I think the process itself is useful, even if the thesis that this program generates isn't actually the one that you want to use. It really does give you, I think, a useful way of thinking about developing a thesis. So first it asks you to state your topic. And so just a few words here. So the topic is not yet the argument, right? We're going to build that into the thesis as we go. So in my example, I'm using video games. And you can always come back to this and experiment and tweak to see, what you come up with in a different try. So then I state my main idea about the topic, the thing that I want to argue, right? The focus of my paper. So I say people should consider video games as more serious art forms. I move on to the next part, which sometimes this isn't always as clear to you until you've been doing more research and brainstorming, but ultimately your paper itself needs to provide reasons to your reader that your idea is right or good, that you'll then back up with evidence later. But when you present your thesis statement in the introduction, it can be helpful to preview some of those reasons so that your reader knows what you're going to focus on and break down for them in your paper. So I give one reason. They, that is video games, have in-depth stories about complex themes, much like works of literature. So I believe that's a reason to take them more seriously. Another reason, it encourages me to write another reason, so I say they are interactive and engage the player in making ethical and moral choices. And so in that way, they're similar to, but go beyond literature as an art form by being interactive. And then I give another reason, and you might be like, I don't know if I have that many reasons. And you could leave that blank, right? You can come back to it later. That's up to you. So it made me keep thinking, okay, they are interactive. Players show evidence of critical and empathetic thinking when playing, which I discovered through research. And then what's an opposing viewpoint? You might not know this yet, so you could leave it blank and see what happens. You don't need to cover this much information necessarily in your thesis statement, but you definitely want a topic. You definitely want to state the opinion you're trying to convince the reader of, and give a couple of reasons that you're going to discuss in your paper in more detail. So let's see what thesis it generates for me. All right. While video games can be just for entertainment, and not all games are deep, people should consider video games as more serious art forms because they have in-depth stories about complex themes, much like works of literature. They are interactive and engage the player in making ethical and moral choices, and players show evidence of critical and empathetic thinking when playing. That's actually not a bad thesis statement, right? So what it does by presenting a potential counter-argument first, I'm anticipating my skeptical reader who's starting to read my paper and already thinking like, can video games really be that good? Aren't they just for fun? What are you talking about? Why are you trying to write a paper about this? And so we address a possible counter-argument, and then we present our opinion and support it by some reasons that are going to be argued further in the body of the paper. I could potentially split this up into 2 sentences. I could rearrange things, but I think it's at least a good brain exercise for coming up with the ingredients for your thesis statement. And whatever it actually generates, you might actually like it. These are still your words. It just ordered them for you, right? And then you can see here, if you're not quite happy with what it came up with, you can try again. Maybe you want to use different words, less detail, more detail. So you could go back All right, so that's it for the thesis video. And next you'll start thinking about how to write your own thesis. And again, it's okay if your initial thesis that you maybe write down now is shorter, is a little uncertain, but the goal is as you research, as you map out and write your paper, you'll come back to your thesis and refine it, make it more specific, make it more reflective of the opinion that you're developing on your topic and what you're going to focus on in your paper. But it's a good idea, even in the early stages, to draft a thesis statement. And I mean, I print it out when I'm working on a paper and I tape it on my desk so I can always see it. And that tells me, okay, Kaylee, as you're researching, this is what you're trying to prove. So keep that in mind when you read this article and when you think about this idea. I think that might be helpful too.